Hello, it is on this day, August 22nd, 2023, that we are talking about being out in the workplace. Now, before we get started, I have 5 disclaimers for this video. Bear with me, we're going to get through them pretty quick here. Number 1, a lot of these bullet points are related to my experience, even though this video isn't directly my story. So, some context you should know before we get into my experience. I've had 3 internships now. The first one was in person at my university. The second one was completely remote with a company. The third one was completely in person at a company. So I've had kind of a range of experiences here, and I will dabble a little bit on virtual versus in person. I also work in a STEM field, so some of the things I'm going to talk about are kind of specific to the STEM field. That doesn't mean it doesn't apply to other fields, but it means that I may talk about things that may not apply to your field, or you have to parse that for yourself and probably do research on what your field thinks about different identities, because there definitely is an impact on what career you're in. So that's a lot of the first point, is we're mostly talking about experiences I've had and advice I've come up with as a result of those experiences. Point number 2. A lot of this video will be referring to trans identities. It's not entirely about trans identities. I'll definitely bring up other topics as well. However, I feel that there were a lot of extra things I had to go through with a trans identity, and I definitely want to cover those things. So it may feel a little bit more skewed that way, but I will still bring up other topics as well. Point number 3. I am now at my parents' house, so there may be dogs barking because they like to bark a lot. I apologize for any barking you hear. Okay. Now we gotta get through the last ones. Hold on. Point number 4. I was pretty much out at all of my workplaces, but at different levels. So my very first one, I was still gender questioning when I was at that job, and I changed my pronouns in the middle of the job, so I can talk a little bit about that. But that may be a out at work, my experiences video, rather than a advice video. But that occurred, and then my second internship, as it was completely online, it didn't really come up as much. And then this last internship, it came up a lot. So a lot of what I'll be talking about will be pertaining to this last internship, probably. But I was out at all of them, and I am talking about this from the point of view of someone who was out, like out. So I can't give much reflection on what it's like to be closeted at work, because I haven't done that. And so I can't do a pros versus cons, really, because I haven't done the other option. I can theorize what the cons and pros would be, but I don't want to theorize about it when perhaps my thoughts would be wrong. So there's that. And then the last thing to note is that the 2 states I've been in during these internships have both been very supportive states. They, even through the recent times that have been going on, both of them have been making more legislation to support trans identities and LGBTQ plus identities. So keep that in mind. I'm specifically talking about my state and my environment. It may not apply to other states or other environments. So there's a level of like career job searching where you need to do research on your region and what you expect from your job. My experience is definitely not across the board at all. So bear that in mind. Alright, with all that said, this video is kind of structured, kind of not. We're just going to figure it out as we go. Initially, I want to talk about how you prepare to be out in the workplace, or how do you determine if you will be out in the workplace or not. And I have a list of things you probably want to do some research into first, before you apply or before your interview. I mean, it's always worth applying to something, even if it's not the best option, because you might not get the options you would prefer. But it's still something to research in the meantime while you're looking into the interviews and trying to make your decision. So, first thing I would research, does your company consider LGBTQ plus identities as a protected class within harassment and those such things? It's usually written in the policy. The policy should be openly accessible, even if it is a government job. It should still be available on the website for everybody to see. So you can do your research just in that simple regard, like, hey, does my company, at the very least, say or claim that they protect these identities from harassment and such things? I think that's the very first step. Now, there's no guarantee that if you were to bring those things up to HR, that they would respond how you would wish, but at that point, if you want to figure that out, you would do some research into like, how have they handled past cases? Has it come up before? Can you find someone on the inside that you can talk to about it? Those kinds of things. Following up, related to finding someone on the inside, the second thing I personally do research on is, does the company have a Pride ERG, an LGBTQ plus ERG of any kind? Can I reach out to someone in that ERG and ask, what is it like? Those were things that I did before I went to this current internship. I met someone in the ERG before I got accepted to the job, and I talked to them about like what it's like, how supportive is the company, and got a good feeling for what to expect going into the internship. And that personally helped me a lot. So just a little piece of advice. But I would look into if your company has an LGBTQ plus ERG. Something I also want to emphasize about this, just because it has a Pride ERG doesn't mean that it's the kind of ERG where you're going to be like having like queer, very out gatherings. There's different kinds of ERGs or different kinds of vibes that you can have in a Pride ERG. So there are some that are very like oriented on educating. There are some that are very like ally oriented. It's all about gathering all the allies together and educating the allies on how to support the actual like queer coworkers they have. There's some that are very queer oriented, where it's just gathering a bunch of LGBTQ plus people and having them like celebrate and just have fun together. So it's also in your interest, if you are interested in doing social gatherings or, you know, Pride ERG things, figuring out what kind of ERG you have at that company, because they can definitely range quite a fair bit. The last thing to consider is that you can also technically start an ERG if you have the resources and the people to do so. Just something to think about. It does take a lot of effort. You need a whole committee. It's a lot. But if you're interested in doing that, there are resources on the internet that you can look into. Okay, also related to the ERG, but separate, point number 3, insurance. Companies usually provide you with health insurance, especially if it's a big company, full-time job kind of deal. And sometimes certain companies cover trans care and other related LGBTQ plus topics in their insurance. So it is interesting to look at your company and see, do they cover these things? If they do, it is a lot more likely that that company is supportive. And if they don't, it's either they're supportive or they're not supportive, correction. They're not supportive, or they don't have the resources, or they just don't feel either way. They might feel they don't have enough LGBTQ plus employees to even include in their policy. So there's definitely a balance there, but the company I worked at had it as part of their policy. Like, we will cover these trans surgeries to this amount and stuff like that as a part of their policy. So it's something to look into, especially if you do have a trans identity. You can capitalize on those resources and it will save you money. Money is very expensive, so it's something to look into. Number 4, this is related to interviews. If you can get an impression of what the person interviewing you is like before the interview, that can definitely affect how you present in your interview. So usually, as every experience I've had, they've told me who's interviewing me before they interview me, usually like a week or 2 in advance. And I will flat out just Google them on the internet, try to get an impression of what they are. I ask the people I know on the inside, like, hey, do you know this person? What can I expect of them? I look at their pronouns, if they have pronouns presented on their pages or if they don't have pronouns included. I look into a lot of those details beforehand, and if you find that they seem like they'll be like a pretty decent person, you can dress however you are most comfortable. You might want to dress comfortable anyway, but you may want to just present flat out your gender identity or your sexuality as well. You can just be open about everything. I included some of my talk about how I've done LGBTQ plus support. I was a board member of a club, did conventions. I actually talked about those things in my interview because I definitely got to feel very quickly that the person I was talking to was supportive. He had pronouns, he addressed my pronouns correctly. So um, definitely get a feel before your interview and during your interview of what you can expect from that individual. Something I'll mention multiple times through this video is that even if the company is supportive, an individual may not be. And even if a company is not supportive, an individual may be. So getting a feel for the person you're talking to, I think, has been a key for me. So that's just a little tidbit piece of advice. I have an advice section later, so I need to stop throwing out these pieces of advice for you, but I can't help but bring them up. So interview is something to look into beforehand. And then lastly, sometimes rather than ERGs, there are like secret societies within companies. Now these are very hard to find because they're secret societies. I happened into one because another trans person found me and saw that I was trans. It was like, and got me in the loop. So the best advice I can give here is to see if you can find other LGBTQ plus people in your workspace. And if you are both comfortable, definitely like talk in your own time if need be. Discuss like, hey, do you know any resources? Do you know any resources? And figure out like if you two will be supportive for each other, like be each other's resource, or if one of you knows of any of those secret societies or gatherings outside work or any local events. Local events are also a great way to find career support that are not related to the company itself if you're working in person. Though I guess it applies if you're working virtually as well. You would just find a local event. So just some things to reflect on before you get to your job. Now, the last thing, more trans specific, name change. Name change is a very, very long, hard process, especially if you're working at a large company. It takes effort, and the earlier you can get your name change drilled in, the less people learn your dead name and the less people use your dead name. Now, when you're applying for your job, you're required to use your legal name. When you are doing any additional content or paperwork, you're required to use your legal name. So it's hard to get that started with HR before your job. So we're going to proceed on the assumption that you got your job and you're at your first week. If you're in your first week, seriously, name change stuff as soon as you can. I emailed all the people who knew me, all the people, my managers and people, the week before, this is the name I go by, these are my pronouns, just to make it clear, even though my badge and all my different things had the wrong name. So I think establishing that connection first, if you are being openly out, or at least like ready to defend your name, I would do those things first thing, as soon as you can, because then they won't share the wrong name, and then less mistakes are made, and it honestly, it feels a lot better when that's happening. And if you have the chance within your first day, if you can like meet them and shake your hand and put a face to the name that you're telling them, it can help them a lot rather than just being someone they never met. I found that people I actually like met, shook their hand with, they got my pronouns and name a lot faster. I think it's something about the interaction of actually introducing yourself makes it stick in their head better. That's my theory. Don't know if that's true, but just something to reflect on. And how you dressed your first day. Again, just get that feel. I went ahead and I wore slacks, belt, tucked in a button up kind of vibe. I did sweat to death. That's something to consider if you're trans mask. If you're in the middle of summer and you're wearing a long sleeve button up and a binder, it's sweaty. It kind of sucks, the things we do, but it happens. So you have to gauge your comfort level with your dressing in the workspace. Dressing can get more people to recognize your correct pronouns, but also some people may not notice. If you wear a pin, realize that a lot of people don't actually look at your chest. That's something I learned during this internship. If you're wearing a pin that has your pronouns, they usually just don't look. Or they look and their brain doesn't process what they're looking at, and so they'll still use the wrong ones. But if you are already being out, there's really no harm in wearing a pin. So it's just something to consider. You can put it on your lanyard if you get like a badge for your workplace. There's a lot of photos on your first day if you have badges at your workplace. I know I'm going to badges a lot, but I had badges. So a lot of photos. If you can get that name changed before you get your badge, you can have your correct name on your badge. But changing your badge afterward is a pain. So it's just something to think about if you do get a badge and that stuff at your workplace. Or if you take photos for your like Microsoft Teams or whatever application you use for work. Be prepared for photos your first day. Also, when they like make an account, an HR account for your company, sometimes they'll take photos for the HR page. So figure out how you'll dress, figure out how you're going to do your hair before you get in at the first day, and then just figure it out as you go and introduce yourself however you're comfortable. I think the first day was one of the days I had the most misgendering just because there's a lot of people that only see you for a few minutes. Like the people who hand you your laptop, the people who give you all these kinds of other things, the HR people who are like, hey, welcome to this company. They don't know who you are, and they tend to assume. So perhaps do some like mental preparation before arriving to your job. I know you're stressed about other things, but I think it's safe to assume that people will gender you and assume your gender when you arrive at the workplace. All right, that's a lot of stuff about gender identities. Apologies for that. But we will now move on to, the first month in the workplace, like getting the office or the actual lab space or the writing space or whatever job you do. What kind of public open space? Maybe a cafeteria. Cafeterias definitely apply here as well. When you reach those open spaces, I think there are a few things to consider. If you have a desk, you choose how to decorate your desk. People don't tend to actually look at your desk from my experience. I had all my pins and everything on my desk. I had a board that had like my pronouns written twice, my pronouns, my university and everything written on it. And I think only a grand total of like 3 people actually looked at my board. It's usually like the people who sit right next to you see it, but the people who don't sit next to you don't usually like go out of their way to go read people's boards or look at how they decorate their desk. So even if you are being openly out like I was, it doesn't mean that that information actually goes far. So I think that's something to consider. It's almost a good thing because it's almost like you're being less out. But it also means that less people know. So there's definitely a balance there. It actually took a week for the other trans person in my office to find me, just because it wasn't very obvious. I was kind of in my own little corner. So it's something to think about. Another thing to think about is in the first week, people may ask you about things that are on your desk, the people who sit next to you in particular. So before you start putting up pins or flags or your pronouns, whatever you put up to declare that you're out, if you are being out in the workplace, something to consider is what questions may I be asked, and am I comfortable answering those questions in this space? Whatever workspace you're working in, if it's public, if it's like a handful of people, it's something to determine early on. Like, hey, what questions can be asked, and how, in front of how many people would I be answering those questions? If I were to whisper, would the person actually hear me, and would other people not hear me, or is this the kind of room where if I whisper, everyone will hear it? I think those are some things to keep in mind, because it definitely came up a few times with me. I flat out wrote on my board that I was comfortable with questions, but then it occurred to me later that when people were asking me questions, there's definitely an audience listening to my answers rather than the person who was asking. So it's something to consider when you do these things. Now, it worked out for me. Most of the people in my workspace were supportive. I had 5+ allies in the office that were ready to like stand up with me if anything were to happen. So that was a good environment for me, but definitely consider it in your environment, and from now on I'm going to consider it in my own environments as well. So something to bear in mind. Um, Pronouns. Pronouns are still not a normalized thing. I feel some companies are working towards it. Some companies are like requiring it as your company profile or on your like email signatures. I know every HR I've interacted with, all the HR people have their pronouns on the HR, but employees, I haven't really seen pronouns be normalized. Even the support employees or the employees that are part of the Proud ERG, I haven't seen a lot of pronouns on their names either. So you might be the only one in your office doing pronouns. You have to consider if you're comfortable with that or if you're not comfortable with that. There's a balance of like, do I challenge these people and make them include pronouns, or do I just stand out? That kind of thing. It's hard to figure out pronouns in the workplace in terms of writing them, and then even more hard to figure out pronouns in the workplace in terms of saying them, because when people introduce themselves, they introduce themselves in a particular pattern, and then you just naturally want to repeat the pattern they introduced themselves, which means that you skip over your pronouns. I can't tell you how many times I've told myself, I'll say my pronouns when I introduce myself, and then I just don't say them. It just doesn't come out. It happened a lot. I mean, a lot. So there's definitely an inherent pressure to being the only person saying your pronouns. May depend on the workplace you're in, but I'm in a STEM field, so it was not happening a lot. People generally liked to assume my pronouns. Occasionally, I was brave enough to correct them, but usually I just didn't. So just some things to think about when you're introducing yourself to the people in your office, to people outside your office, the people you're working with, people at the events at the beginning when they take on the new hires. Sometimes it's hard to fit in those details. Another thing to consider, which will be broad to most queer identities, for some reason that I personally don't understand, people at the workplace love to talk about their partners and ask, like, do you have anyone at home? Do you have partners? Like, it came up a fair amount. Now, not necessarily the way I just said it, but people will bring up their significant others and then, like, imply for you to bring up yours or stuff like that. Or, like, people will jokingly share, like, dating stories and stuff like that. So there's definitely an interesting interaction there. It's kind of one of those, seemingly to me, it seems like one of those default conversations that people like to bring up in the workplace. So you have to determine beforehand, like, how would you, if you have like a queer relationship, how would you talk about your relationship? How would you refer to your partner? If you're ace or aerospec, like, how would you respond? Would you just say, like, I'm not interested? Or would you actually say, I'm asexual? You gotta think about some of those things. I had to think about a lot of those on the fly. And I got various results. Sometimes I brought up that I was ace. Sometimes I just distanced myself from the discussion. I have a very particular perspective in that regard. But what I can reflect on is some of the other people in my workplace who were in queer relationships. A lot of them just used the broad term significant other because then it didn't give away the gender of their partner. And no, everyone reacted normally to that. Seemingly, it sounded natural in the conversation. It didn't really stand out to anybody. It felt like something that everyone just got it. So that was one of the details I noticed. We did have someone in the workplace who was polyamory, and no one reacted negatively to that. I can't recall if she flat out mentioned both of them in the same sentence, but she would just refer to each of her partners and no one really batted an eye at it. So there's definitely possibilities. There's ways to phrase your wording where it's not very obvious, but then the people who are supportive get it, if you know what I mean, like kind of like inside knowledge. So you can try to manipulate your words in that way, or you can just be honest, or you can just meander around the subject so that people don't ask. So a lot of different ways to go about it. you determine if you want to put photos of your partners on your desk. People do tend to ask about photos on your desk. Even if they don't look at the words on your desk, if you have a photo, they'll be like, who's in the photo? So that is one of those things that people are curious. They like to know, like, who is that with you in that photo? This is just something to bear in mind. I'm gonna take a sip of water. My department had a lot of department events, and usually they'll like invite your partners and stuff to those events. It's not just for people working in the company. So you have the option to go to these events outside of work with your partner, and then if you do, you have to consider the fact that the people who met your partner know who your partner is, but the people who didn't go to that event don't know, and then you're kind of juggling information. That's one of the hardest things about coming out to certain people and not other people, is you have to start juggling who are you out to, who are you not out to, and figure out if you want to repeat information just in case they don't know, or if you want to just be hands off and whoever knows knows, whoever doesn't know doesn't know, kind of thing. It is hard to juggle. I just had that yesterday where I assumed someone knew and they didn't know, and then I was like, oop, after the fact, and I had to like come out to them on the spot because I kind of messed it up. So it's hard. Yeah, I think it's safer to repeat it. If it's someone you want to be out to, I think it's safer to repeat it than to assume that they already know, from my gathering. Especially when it comes to simple things like pronouns. I would repeat your pronouns, because the more you repeat your pronouns, the more likely they'll remember them anyway. But with other things like, oh yeah, I'm transgender, there's a balance there. I think I'll let y'all determine that balance. Oh man, a lot of talking today. I guess there's one mini topic I want to address. Topic switching. Wow. Department switching. If you change managers, I just had this happen to me. It's a little scary because you don't know who your new manager is, and you have to get a good feel for that manager pretty quickly when you're changing departments. So I had my meeting with my manager shortly before I changed departments, like a few days before I changed departments. And so I looked at my desk and I was like, okay, what do I want to share? What do I not want to share? I moved all my pins over so it wouldn't show my identities, but I still had my pronouns showing. And I dressed more masculine that day. And I just said hello, hoped that my pronouns were evident on my board and didn't say my pronouns as to not like force them. And very quickly he was like, I'm supportive. I was like, sweet. But there's definitely a gamble when it comes to those meetings, and managers are important people. Managers, project leads, mentors, if your company does mentors, those are kind of significant people. And so I think those are the most important people to juggle identities with, in my experience. In other cases, it can be hard. I also found, just piece of advice, I also found that being blunt with IT is the easiest. IT is dealing with a lot of things every single day, and if you're roundabout with your identity with IT, they might not understand what you're talking about. So with IT, I'd be very straightforward. I'd be like, hey, I need this name change for my mental health, and then they'll get it done. But if you're just like, hey, can you guys do this name change, and if they think it's a nickname thing, then it's going to fall down on their priority. Something to consider. The same thing applies to HR as well. All right. We talk about remote work. I'll get there in a second. If you're working remotely, people don't know you as well. You have less prevalence in their life. I don't know how else to describe that, but like when someone's working remotely, their presence isn't felt as much, and so then the importance of their name and their pronouns and those things isn't as prevalent. And so they might forget information about you. They might just not bother to get the right information about you. They might just assume things about you. there's definitely some points there. My virtual internship, the very first meeting, the project lead misgendered me, and I just corrected it right there in front of everybody, all 4 people of my project. Corrected it in front of everybody and was like, hey, I will reinforce this. And doing that made it so it was solid for the rest of the internship. But when someone new joined the group, they wouldn't know. And because they weren't there when I did the across the board thing, and because we rarely talked to each other, it was one of those things where he never really got it. So when you're in person, again, when you see people every single day, the information stores in your mind. But when you see them in like a 30-minute call in the morning, the information doesn't stick. So when you're working virtually, there's definitely a different interaction between people. There's a different method of storing information about people. I would recommend doing pronouns as part of your name if your company lets you. Some companies don't let you edit your name. But if you can, add your pronouns as part of your name. That's great. Get that name change early on. Update the names so that everyone sees the correct name. Generally, with the STEM workplace, which I work in, you're expected to blur your background. But the very funny thing is that if you have something like this right here in your background and you blur it, it's still very obvious what it is. So bear that in mind. If you have a pride flag in your background and you don't have a virtual background, it will still be very obvious that you have a pride flag. So you have to determine if you want people to see a blurred out pride flag or if you want to put on a virtual background so that people can't see it. And if you move your arm by where the background is, it will kind of show as well. So just be aware of your surroundings, be aware of what you're showing when you're in a virtual workspace. And then, again, if you are working virtually, but then you meet someone in person for the first time, I think it's just respectful / almost expected in some places to reintroduce yourself as if you are meeting for the first time. That's my experience. That's what I've gathered from people. So something to reflect on. And again, how you dress is how you dress. You determine that yourself. If you want to be very or not. Up to you. Do I have any other points? We talked about being in virtual workspace. If you're working on a university, very, very small section of my crowd, but if you are working at a university, universities also have policies just like companies do, so you can look at the university policy. If you're working for a professor specifically, I would ask other professors what they think of that professor, or other students, TAs. TAs work the professor a lot, so they have some good experience, good inside knowledge on what that person is like. So just networking and figuring out like what you can expect from a certain person is good. I would say overall, the workplaces I have been in didn't discourage talking about identities. We were completely allowed to talk about whatever we wanted to talk about in the workplace, provided that it was within workplace policy, so we couldn't talk about, like alcohol and stuff like that actively. You can talk about alcohol, but you can't talk about like going out and doing things with it. But as long as you're within those guidelines, you're allowed to be as open and talkative about whatever you want as you want. So depending on your workplace and depending on your environment, it doesn't mean that you have to be like very hush-hush about your identity. You can talk about your partners. You can be openly LGBT if you would wish. Towards the end of my internship, me and one of the other people in the office were flat out like bantering, like doing LGBT bantering back and forth. He is the kind of person who says, "Oh wow, that's so homophobic." And everyone was fine with that in the workplace. We checked in with everybody. Everybody was okay with it. And as long as everyone's comfortable with it, then there's no issue. Because I was working with a bunch of other people my age and we're all younger, I felt it was more acceptable to do that than when I was working with my projects, which had more adults. So another thing to think about is like, how would the people in your workplace react to different behaviors? That said, though, even with one of my projects, I was still like open about some of my trans experiences, and they like liked that I was talking about it. They liked hearing what it's like from an inside perspective. So, not to repeat myself again, but you have to gauge what your environment is like and gauge who you're talking to on an individual to individual basis, because every individual can believe certain things. And then you can talk about whatever you're comfortable talking about. And if someone seems uncomfortable with the subject, then you may need to reflect on that. As long as it doesn't come up to a manager, you're pretty much fine, as far as I can gather. Yeah. Oh, Pride. Also Pride. If you do have a Pride ERG, Pride ERGs tend to do parades at Pride. And so if you would like to walk in the parade, you can go walk in the parade. I did that this year. And it is fun. It is fun to walk in the parade. You get to see a lot more people when you're walking in the parade than you do when you're just standing in one spot watching the parade. So, pretty cool experience. I would highly recommend. Alright, I'm going to sip some more water and then gather my thoughts for the epilogue/conclusion. So to close it out, we have a summary/advice section. Some of this is just repeating some of the advice I've given earlier, and some of it is just reminding you of some of the key details I mentioned. Number 1, do the name change early if you can. Seriously, it takes forever. It takes absolutely forever. Some of the first name changes happen early on, but if you're at a large company and you're using a lot of software, they have to update it for every separate third-party software company. So it takes time. Sometimes you're going to have to be assertive, both in your workplace when you're being out to people, whether you're correcting someone on some assumption they made about you, or if you're being assertive and being the person using pronouns and trying to get other people to add pronouns to your presentation. Even if you're not trans, even as an ally, get people to use pronouns in their presentation. You may have to be assertive in that way. And also, oh my god, my brain just blanked. No. What was the first point again? Oh, being assertive to IT and HR about name and pronouns and those things. Any assumptions they make about you. Just being assertive about all those things. It may come up, and it's not ideal, but it's something to keep in mind. People may not stand up for you when it comes to these things, even if they do know your pronouns. There are people in the workplace who have never had to correct someone else before, and sometimes they just won't step in and do it for you. So you may have to stand up for yourself, at least initially in the workspace. It's something to keep in mind. When you're introducing yourself, sometimes your introduction doesn't go as you plan. So that's one of those hard things to balance. People in the workplace like to ask about your significant other, especially if you're wearing a ring or if you have a photo of your significant other on your desk. So you may have to think of how am I going to talk about this if they ask? Figure that out. Is your significant other comfortable with you talking about them at work? Something you would have to discuss with them. Look for ERGs. Research your interviewer or your project, the people in your project, to figure out and gauge how out you can be in that space. After working at a company for a while, you may find that you can just talk openly in that space, or it may be a space where they're very only talk about work in the workspace. So need to figure out that balance as you're moving along. And then outside events outside work. How comfortable are outside of events with bringing up those topics and such things. I think those were a lot of the key points. Just keep an eye on your surroundings. You determine how you want to dress, how you want to decorate your desk. People are generally understanding if you're in the process of buying clothes because you just transitioned. People are generally understanding of that if they are aware of the situation from my experience. And the thing that I didn't mention again from the beginning is that I have been in some supportive states during these times, so I have had some local events I've gone to as well to charge my battery whenever I was getting misgendered at work. So it's just something to consider. If you have the availability of local events, you can go to those as well on top of whatever you have at work. All right, a lot of information, not very organized information, so I apologize for the big ramble, but these were a lot of the thoughts I've had throughout the summer. I loved my internship. I'm now a year-long intern. This is important because it means I will be busy for this whole school year, so we'll see how often I do these videos. I might continue the 2-month pattern since I've done it multiple months now. Maybe I might do the once-a-month pattern. We'll figure out whatever comes together. But I do have a list of topics written that I want to talk about. So the ideas are there. I just need to take action on the ideas. And with all that said, again, I'll be busy for a time, but you may see me around on the book channel. Maybe streaming. I'll be streaming all of October, but that's a ways from now, so we'll see. Ow! Alright, with all that said, I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.